I've watched eyes grow wide 100 times as I've told the story of that dusty summer of 1878, when a town learned just how wrong a man's measure could be. Some say I embellish the tale, but those who were there know. Some truths are stranger than any fiction a man could dream up. Before we dive deeper into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and if you enjoy stories of justice being served, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow we've got something special planned for you. Thornwood wasn't much different from any other cattle town that sprouted up along the Kansas-Colorado Trail, a collection of weather-beaten buildings, a church that saw more card games than prayers, and enough saloons to drown a man's troubles 3 times over. The wind carried the constant scent of cattle and dust, and most days the sun beat down hard enough to make a man question his choice to venture this far west. But Thornwood had one thing that set it apart from every other muddy stop along the trail: the Hawkins brothers. Buck, Cole, and Wesley Hawkins had carved out their own kingdom with hot lead and cold hearts, turning what could have been honest cattle country into their personal empire. They'd shown up 5 years earlier with a handful of riders and more ambition than conscience. Started small, offering protection to the merchants, taking their cut from the cattle drives, squeezing out anyone who dared to compete with their interests. Those who refused their generous offers had a way of disappearing, their homesteads mysteriously burning down, or their bodies found in shallow graves out on the prairie. The Hawkins boys ran everything worth running: the cattle drives, the supply routes, even the law itself. Sheriff Wade was just another gun on their payroll, his badge nothing but brass-plated permission to look the other way. They'd ground honest folk under their boots for so long that most people in Thornwood had forgotten what it felt like to stand tall. Old Tom Jenkins at the general store couldn't stock his shelves without their approval. Mary Sullivan's boarding house had to pay insurance every month, though what she was being insured against was clear enough: the Hawkins brothers themselves. Even Doc Wallace, the town's only physician, had to treat their boys first, no matter how urgent other patients might be. That all changed the day Timothy Crane limped into town. He didn't look like much, a slight figure who could have been blown away by a strong wind, with wire-rimmed spectacles and clothes that had seen better days. His right leg dragged slightly when he walked, and he carried himself like a man who'd spent more time with books than broncos. The kind of man the Hawkins brothers loved to break, just to hear the sound it made. I remember that morning clear as yesterday. The sun had just burned the dew off the sage when he came hobbling down Main Street, leading a sorry-looking mule loaded with what looked like books and papers. Sarah Wallace, the doc's daughter, was sweeping the boardwalk in front of her father's office when she first spotted him. "Mister," she'd called out, kind soul that she was, "you look like you could use a rest and some water." Crane had tipped his hat with a gentility that seemed out of place in our rough corner of the world. "Most kind, miss," he'd said, his voice soft and cultured, like Eastern schooling had smoothed away any rough edges. "I don't suppose you could direct me to someone who might have a room to let?" That's when Wesley Hawkins, the youngest and meanest of the brothers, came stumbling out of Potter's saloon, already deep in his cups despite the early hour. His boots thumped heavy on the boardwalk as he approached the newcomer, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "Well, well," Wesley drawled, loud enough to draw attention from passers-by. "Looks like we got ourselves a real gentleman caller. Ain't that fancy?" Crane didn't react, just stood there quiet-like, one hand resting on his mule's lead rope, the other hanging loose at his side. There was something about that stance that caught my eye, something that didn't quite fit with his frail appearance, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "I'm simply looking for lodging," Crane said mildly. "I've been hired as the new schoolmaster." That got a laugh from Wesley and the 2 ranch hands who'd followed him out of the saloon. "Schoolmaster? Ain't that precious? Hey, boys, looks like we're gonna get ourselves some education." Sarah Wallace had backed away, knowing trouble when she saw it. Most folks did the same, ducking into doorways or finding urgent business elsewhere. We'd all seen Wesley's idea of fun before, and nobody wanted to be around for it. "Perhaps," Crane suggested quietly, "you could point me toward Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house? I understand she has rooms available." Wesley's hand shot out quick as a striking snake grabbing Crane's shirt front. "Maybe first you need a lesson in how we do things in Thornwood. See, nothing happens here without the Hawkins brothers say so. Nothing and nobody comes or goes without our approval. What happened next was so quick, most folks who saw it still argue about the details. One moment Wesley had hold of Crane's shirt. The next, he was sitting in the dust, looking confused as a cow in a cornfield. Crane hadn't appeared to move at all. "My apologies," Crane said, adjusting his spectacles with one finger. "I'm afraid my leg sometimes causes me to lose my balance. I do hope you're not hurt." Wesley scrambled to his feet, face red with rage and embarrassment. His hand moved toward his gun, but one of his companions grabbed his arm. "Easy, Wes," the ranch hand muttered. "Buck said no shooting in the street, remember? Not after last time." Wesley spat in the dust. "This ain't over, schoolmaster. You best learn your place quick or someone's gonna have to teach you proper." As Wesley and his boys stalked off, I noticed something peculiar. Despite the confrontation, Crane's breathing hadn't quickened, his hands hadn't shaken, and his eyes, behind those wire-rimmed spectacles, had stayed calm and watchful throughout. It was almost as if... But no, that couldn't be right. He was just a schoolmaster, wasn't he? Little did we know, but that quiet morning was about to spark a fire that would burn away all the shadows in Thornwood, and show us that sometimes the most dangerous man isn't the one with the fastest gun. It's the one smart enough to make you think he doesn't have a gun at all. Word of the schoolmaster's encounter with Wesley spread through Thornwood faster than a prairie fire. Most folks figured he'd be gone by sunset, if he was lucky enough to live that long. The Hawkins brothers weren't known for their forgiveness, and Wesley had the kind of mean streak that grew with every bottle of whiskey he emptied. But Timothy Crane didn't leave. Instead, he took a room at Mary Sullivan's boarding house, paid 3 months in advance with gold eagles that raised more than a few eyebrows, and set about converting the abandoned mercantile into a proper schoolhouse. There was something almost deliberate in how he went about his business, like a man playing a part he'd rehearsed countless times. I watched him from my spot on the porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, where I'd been working as a piano player since losing my ranch to the Hawkins' schemes. There was a precision to his movements that didn't match his apparent infirmity. The way he tested the weight of each board before nailing it into place, how his eyes constantly scanned the street while appearing to focus on his work. Little things that most folks missed but stood out clear as dawn to anyone who'd spent time in dangerous company. Sarah Wallace took to helping him in the afternoons, bringing lemonade and sharing books from her father's library. "He knows things," she told me one evening while I played a quiet tune on the piano. "Not just book learning, but real things. The way he talks about the world outside Thornwood, it's like he's seen every corner of it." But it wasn't just Sarah who found herself drawn to the peculiar schoolmaster. Despite their parents' fears of Hawkins' retribution, children started gathering around him, listening to stories of far-off places and learning their letters in the dust of the street. Even some of the adults would linger, pretending to go about their business while straining to hear tales of a world beyond the reach of bullies and bullets. Cole Hawkins, the middle brother and the brains of the family, took notice. He wasn't one to let any potential threat grow unchecked, no matter how seemingly insignificant. "Send Wyatt to keep an eye on him," he told his younger brother. "Something ain't right about that gimpy schoolmaster." Wyatt Carter was the best tracker the Hawkins boys had, capable of reading sign like most men read newspapers. He spent 3 days watching Crane, studying his habits, trying to piece together the puzzle of the man's existence. What he reported back had Cole Hawkins reaching for his whiskey bottle. "He's wrong," Wyatt said, his usual confidence shaken. "The limp changes. Sometimes it's the right leg, sometimes the left. Sometimes there's no limp at all when he thinks nobody's watching. And those books he carries? Some ain't even real, just wooden blocks painted to look like books." That got Buck Hawkins's attention. The eldest brother had been cleaning his revolver, a habit he had when thinking deep. "You think he's law?" "Law don't send cripples," Wesley spat, still nursing his wounded pride. "He's just some uppity Easterner needs teaching his place." But Cole wasn't convinced. He remembered stories from during the war, whispers about a Union operative who could change his appearance like a chameleon, who'd infiltrated Confederate camps by playing roles so perfectly that not even their own soldiers questioned him. They'd called him the ghost actor, and no one had ever discovered his true identity. The tension in Thornwood grew thick as summer molasses. Everyone could feel something building, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. The Hawkins brothers' men began showing up at the schoolhouse, making their presence known, trying to intimidate parents into keeping their children away. But Crane seemed immune to their threats, greeting each attempt at intimidation with the same mild manner he showed everyone. Then came the morning someone fired a shot through his window at the boarding house. The bullet hole was neat and precise, exactly where a man's head would be if he'd been sleeping in his bed. But Crane hadn't been in bed. Mrs. Sullivan swore she'd heard him moving about his room all night, as if he'd known trouble was coming. "You need to leave, Mr. Crane," Sarah pleaded with him that afternoon. "They won't stop until they've killed you." Crane was examining the bullet hole with an interest that seemed more professional than fearful. "Tell me, Miss Wallace," he said quietly, "how many people have the Hawkins brothers killed since they took control of Thornwood?" 12 that we know of," she whispered. "Maybe more. And how many families have they driven away? How many lives have they destroyed with their greed?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. "Then perhaps," Crane said, his voice carrying a hint of steel beneath its gentle tone, "it's time someone taught them a different kind of lesson." Something in the way he said it made me pause in my playing, the piano keys falling silent under my fingers. For just a moment, the scholarly facade slipped, and I caught a glimpse of something else, something hard and dangerous as a coiled rattler in the shade. Then he smiled, adjusted his spectacles, and went back to being the mild-mannered schoolmaster. But that evening, as I watched him make his way down the darkening street, I noticed how his shadow seemed to move with a predator's grace, betraying none of the limp its owner displayed. And I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the Hawkins brothers had finally bitten off more than they could chew. Word was already spreading through town that the ghost actor might not be just a war story after all, and the Hawkins brothers were about to learn that they weren't the only ones who knew how to play a role. The morning after the shooting, Buck Hawkins himself paid a visit to the schoolhouse. He wasn't like his brothers. Where Wesley was all fire and Cole was cunning, Buck carried himself with the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire on other people's fear. He found Crane teaching 6 children their letters, seemingly unconcerned about the events of the previous night. "Quite a scare you had," Buck said, his spurs jingling as he stepped into the converted mercantile. The children fell silent, eyes wide with fear. Everyone in Thornwood knew that Buck Hawkins's attention was something to be avoided at all costs. "Children," Crane said quietly, "I believe it's time for your lunch break." He waited until they'd scurried out before turning to face Buck. "Mr. Hawkins, I presume. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Buck moved through the room like a wolf sizing up prey, running his finger along the freshly cleaned desks. "You've caused quite a stir, Mr. Crane. My brother Wesley feels particularly aggrieved by your presence." "Aggrieved?" Crane adjusted his spectacles. "Simply because he lost his balance while attempting to assault me? That hardly seems reasonable. Reasonable ain't got nothing to do with it." Buck's hand rested casually on his gun belt. "See, respect is like currency in Thornwood. Wesley lost some, which means our family lost some. That's bad for business." "Perhaps," Crane suggested mildly, "your brother should consider making deposits in a different kind of currency. Knowledge, for instance. I'd be happy to include him in my adult education classes." The mockery was subtle, but it was there. Buck's eyes narrowed. "You're either very brave or very foolish, schoolmaster. Though I'm beginning to suspect you ain't much of either." That's when something strange happened. For just a moment, Crane's posture changed. The scholarly stoop vanished, his shoulders squared, and his eyes, those mild, bespectacled eyes, turned hard as gunmetal. "What do you think I am, Mr. Hawkins?" Buck's hand tightened on his gun. "I think you're someone playing a role. Question is, why?" "Sometimes," Crane said softly, "the best way to teach a lesson is to make the students think they're the ones in control." The threat was clear, though wrapped in scholarly metaphor. Buck Hawkins hadn't survived this long by ignoring such warnings. He backed toward the door, never taking his eyes off Crane. "We'll be watching you, schoolmaster. One wrong move, one step out of line, and..." "And what?" Crane's voice carried a note of amusement. "You'll send another marksman to shoot at an empty bed? You'll have Wesley try his luck again? Or perhaps you'll finally step into the fight yourself?" Buck reached the doorway, his face dark with suppressed rage. "This is my town, schoolmaster. Best you remember that." "Your town?" Crane shook his head sadly. "No, Mr. Hawkins. Thornwood belongs to its people. They've just forgotten that temporarily." After Buck left, Sarah Wallace emerged from the back room where she'd been organizing books. Her face was pale. "I've never heard anyone talk to Buck Hawkins like that before. Not and live to tell about it." "Bullies, Miss Wallace, are like mad dogs," Crane said, returning to his usual mild manner. "They mistake kindness for weakness and courtesy for cowardice. Sometimes the only way to deal with them is to show them their own reflection." That afternoon, strange things began happening in Thornwood. 3 of the Hawkins' best horses disappeared from their corrals, only to be found miles away near Devil's Canyon. The strongbox in their ranch house, hidden behind a painting and secured with 2 locks, somehow migrated to Sheriff Wade's office, along with documentation of every bribe they'd paid him. The sheriff's face turned the color of old paste when he found it sitting on his desk the next morning. Nobody had broken in. At least none of the doors or windows showed signs of tampering. It was as if a ghost had walked through the walls. Cole Hawkins, investigating the incidents, found something that chilled him more than the thefts themselves. In the dust outside the ranch house window, there were boot prints that appeared and disappeared as if their owner had materialized from thin air. And strangest of all, the prints showed no sign of a limp. "It's him," Cole told his brothers that evening. "Has to be." The ghost actor didn't just infiltrate Confederate camps during the war. He was a retrieval specialist, could get in and out of anywhere, steal anything, and no one ever saw him do it. "Then we end him," Wesley snarled, reaching for his gun. "Not that simple," Buck said thoughtfully. "Man like that, he's playing a deeper game. Question is, what's his real target?" They found out the next morning when they discovered every ledger, every document detailing their illegal operations, had vanished from their supposedly secure office. In their place was a single sheet of paper covered in precise handwriting. "Gentlemen, your education begins now. Lesson 1. Everything you believe you control can be taken from you in an instant. Consider this your first homework assignment. There will be a test. Yours sincerely, the schoolmaster." "He's toying with us," Cole said, his usual composure cracking, like a cat with a mouse. But Buck was studying the note with an expression that might have been respect. "No," he said slowly. "He's teaching us something all right, teaching us what it feels like to be helpless, like all them folks we've been stepping on these past 5 years." That's when they heard the commotion from the street. The townspeople were gathering, and at the center of the crowd was Timothy Crane, still limping slightly, still adjusting his spectacles with that scholarly air. But now he was reading aloud from a familiar book, the Hawkins' own record of their crimes, names and dates and dollar amounts all laid bare in the morning sun. The time for shadows and secrets was ending. The real lesson was about to begin, and Thornwood was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is a teacher who decides to show his students the truth about themselves. The next few days in Thornwood felt like the calm before a tornado, that eerie stillness where even the birds stop singing, knowing something wicked is about to break loose. The Hawkins brothers had retreated to their ranch outside town, but their absence felt more threatening than their presence ever had. Everyone knew they were planning something. The only question was what. Meanwhile, Timothy Crane continued his lessons, both in the schoolhouse and on the streets of Thornwood. Each morning, more of the Hawkins secrets appeared, posted on the church door or nailed to the saloon wall. Records of murdered homesteaders, proof of cattle rustling operations, lists of bribes paid to officials all the way to the territorial capital. But it wasn't just the brothers' crimes he was exposing. He was showing the town its own reflection, how fear had made them complicit in their own oppression. Ain't just the Hawkins boys that are getting schooled, old Tom Jenkins said one evening at the Silver Dollar. Way I figure it, whole town's getting an education. He was right. People started standing straighter, looking each other in the eye again. When one of the remaining Hawkins men tried to collect their weekly protection money, Mary Sullivan told him where he could stick his demands. The whole street held its breath, waiting for reprisal, but none came. The enforcer just backed away, looking uncertain in a world where the old rules no longer seemed to apply. But it was what happened at Doc Wallace's place that really set tongues wagging. 2 of Wesley's boys had shown up, looking to force the doctor to treat their friend's bullet wound. Seems they'd had a disagreement with some farmers over cattle grazing rights. They found Crane there, supposedly having his leg examined. "Doctor's busy," Crane had said mildly, not even looking up from the medical text he was pretending to read. "Perhaps you gentlemen could come back tomorrow?" "Maybe you didn't hear right," the larger of the 2 said, reaching for his gun. "This ain't a request." What happened next became part of Thornwood legend. Without appearing to move from his chair, Crane somehow disarmed both men. Their guns simply vanished, as if plucked away by invisible hands. Then he proceeded to give them a detailed lecture on human anatomy, specifically focusing on all the ways a man could be hurt without leaving a mark. The human body, he'd explained, his voice still gentle and instructive, is remarkably fragile in certain places. For instance, the brachial plexus, a network of nerves running through the shoulder. The slightest pressure can cause excruciating pain. As if to demonstrate, he made a small gesture, and both men dropped to their knees, faces white with agony. "Of course, Waitan," he continued. "This is merely theoretical. I would never advocate violence as a solution to problems. That's the Hawkins way, isn't it? But education, now that opens up all sorts of possibilities." They fled, leaving their guns behind. Doc Wallace, who'd watched the whole thing, later told me his hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold his instruments. "Never seen anything like it," he said. "Man moved like smoke in a wind. And his eyes, why, those weren't no schoolmaster's eyes." The incident brought Cole Hawkins himself into town, alone this time, looking for answers. He found Crane in the schoolhouse after hours, writing mathematics problems on the blackboard. "The ghost actor," Cole said without preamble. "You worked with Sherman during his march to the sea, infiltrated Confederate camps, gathered intelligence, eliminated key targets. They say you could walk through enemy lines like a spirit, that no disguise could reveal you, no security could stop you." Crane turned from the blackboard, chalk dust on his fingers. "Fascinating theory. Though I'm curious, what makes you think I'm this ghost of yours?" "Because I was there." Cole's voice was tight with memory. "Atlanta, 64. Watched you walk into our camp dressed as a Confederate colonel, bold as brass. You dined with our commander, shared his whiskey, got him talking about troop movements. Next morning he was dead and you were gone. Took me years to piece it together, but I never forgot your eyes." "The war's over, Mr. Hawkins." "Is it?" Cole stepped closer. "Then why are you here? Why this town? Why us?" Crane set down his chalk, carefully wiping his hands on a cloth. "Perhaps I simply believe in education, in teaching people about consequences, about justice." "This ain't about justice," Cole spat. "This is about revenge. What did we do to draw you here? Which of our enemies hired you?" "You still don't understand," Crane said softly. "No one hired me. I chose this town precisely because you hadn't wronged me personally, because your kind of evil is commonplace, mundane. Men like you and your brothers exist in every territory, every state. Bullies who mistake cruelty for strength, who build empires on other people's fear. And you've appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner?" Cole's hand strayed toward his gun. "No, Mr. Hawkins. I'm simply a teacher. The town itself will decide your fate. I'm just—" He smiled, that mild, scholarly smile. "Providing the necessary education." Cole's gun cleared leather with lightning speed, but he was shooting at empty air. Crane had vanished, seemingly between one breath and the next. Only his voice remained, echoing in the schoolhouse. You should be proud, Mr. Hawkins. Your family has inspired today's most important lesson, the difference between power and strength. Power is what you take from others. Strength is what you give them. Tomorrow, Thornwood learns which is greater. Cole ran from the schoolhouse, his face the color of old chalk. That night, fires burned late at the Hawkins ranch as riders came and went. They were gathering their forces, calling in every gun hand and hired killer who owed them favors. By dawn, they'd have an army. But as I watched from my place at the saloon piano, I noticed something strange. Every time a rider left the Hawkins ranch, Timothy Crane would make a note in a small book, his precise handwriting recording names and descriptions. He wasn't just watching, he was taking attendance. The real test was about to begin, and suddenly I wasn't sure who was teaching whom. Dawn broke over Thornwood like a fever dream. The Hawkins brothers had gathered their army, 30 hardened gunmen who'd taken over the main street, lounging on porches and in doorways like coyotes waiting for a wounded deer. The townsfolk huddled in their homes, watching through curtained windows as the morning sun caught the gleam of gun barrels and spurs. But Timothy Crane didn't hide. He walked out of Mary Sullivan's boarding house at exactly 8 o'clock, same as every morning, his limp more pronounced than ever. He carried his usual stack of books, wire-rimmed spectacles catching the early light. If he noticed the gunmen tracking his every move, he gave no sign. "Sure is a lot of new students in town today," he commented to Sarah Wallace, who'd bravely come out to sweep the boardwalk in front of her father's office. "Though I fear they may be more interested in lead than learning." That's when Buck Hawkins made his move. He rode down the center of the street, flanked by his brothers, their horses' hooves raising dust in the morning air. They pulled up in front of the schoolhouse, where Crane stood calmly arranging his books on the porch. "Time for your last lesson, schoolmaster," Buck called out, his voice carrying across the silent street, "about how things really work in the territories." Crane looked up from his books, adjusting his spectacles. "Ah, the Hawkins brothers, all together. How convenient. I was just preparing today's anatomy lesson. Would you care to participate? We'll be discussing vital organs and their vulnerability to various calibers of ammunition." The threat, wrapped in scholarly language, hung in the air like gun smoke. Wesley's face turned purple with rage, but Cole held up a hand to stop his younger brother from doing anything rash. "We know who you are," Cole said. "The ghost actor. The shadow that haunted Confederate camps. The man who could be anyone, anywhere. But your war's over and this ain't your fight." "On the contrary," Crane replied, setting down his books with careful precision. "Education is always my fight, and you three have provided such excellent teaching opportunities. Lesson 1, the nature of fear. Lesson 2, the price of silence. And today's lesson." He smiled, that mild, scholarly smile. "Well, today we learn about consequences. Enough talk." Wesley drew his gun with lightning speed, but somehow Crane was no longer where he'd been standing. The shot shattered a window behind where he'd been, and suddenly the street erupted into chaos. Gunmen who'd been lounging on porches found their weapons mysteriously missing or jammed. Others fired at shadows that seemed to appear and disappear like morning mist. And through it all, Crane's voice carried clearly, as if he were still giving a lesson. The human body has remarkable capabilities when properly trained. The average man can move only so fast, but with the right knowledge of anatomy, physics, and the psychology of perception. A gunman went down, his legs swept from under him by an unseen force. One can appear to be in multiple places simultaneously. Buck and Cole fired at a movement by the saloon, only to hear Crane's voice behind them. Of course, the mind's ability to process visual information is limited. Show people what they expect to see. Another gunman's weapon vanished from his hand. And they'll never notice what you're actually doing. The street had become a theater of the impossible. Hired killers with decades of experience found themselves disarmed and disabled by what seemed to be a ghost. Some swore they saw Crane in multiple places at once. Others claimed he seemed to walk through solid walls. The few who got close enough to fight hand-to-hand discovered that his apparent limp and weakness had been a masterful disguise. He moved like a striking rattler, each blow precisely targeted to disable without killing. "You see?" Crane's voice echoed from somewhere near the church, then the saloon, then behind the general store. "Violence isn't about strength or speed. It's about knowledge. Understanding the human body, human psychology, human limitations." "Show yourself," Buck roared, his composure finally cracking. "Fight like a man." "But I am showing myself." Crane appeared suddenly in the middle of the street, looking exactly as he had that first day, slight, scholarly, with his wire-rimmed spectacles and apparent limp. "I'm simply demonstrating that what you see isn't always what's real." Wesley, driven mad by fear and frustration, charged forward with a roar. His gun blazed, sending bullets tearing through the morning air. But each shot seemed to pass through Crane as if he were made of smoke. Then Wesley felt a tap on his shoulder, turned, and found himself staring into those calm, educated eyes. "The most dangerous assumption," Crane said softly, "is believing that strength must be visible." His hand moved in a blur, and Wesley collapsed, his gun clattering in the dust. Cole tried to outthink their opponent, attempted to predict where he would appear next based on the patterns he'd observed during the war. But Crane seemed to read his mind, always appearing where Cole least expected. "The second most dangerous assumption," Crane's voice came from behind him, "is believing you can outthink someone who's already 3 moves ahead." One by one, the hired guns fled or fell, leaving only the Hawkins brothers. Buck stood his ground, his face a mask of cold fury as he watched his carefully built empire crumbling around him. "Who are you, he meinen? Here I stand dead there for iron." "Really?" Crane walked toward him, and for the first time there was no trace of the limp, no scholarly stoop to his shoulders. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the sun, momentarily hiding his eyes. "I'm exactly what I claim to be, Mr. Hawkins. A teacher. And today's final lesson is about to begin." The town held its breath, watching as the maestro of deception prepared to conduct his final act. The real question wasn't whether the Hawkins brothers would fall, it was what Thornwood would learn from their downfall. The morning sun had climbed high over Thornwood, casting short shadows across a street littered with dropped guns and wounded pride. Buck Hawkins stood alone now, his brothers disabled but not dead. Another calculated lesson from the schoolmaster who'd systematically dismantled their empire. "Your final exam, Mr. Hawkins," Crane said softly, standing in the center of the street. "Will you learn from your mistakes, or will you die repeating them?" Buck's face twisted with rage. "You think this changes anything? Fear runs deeper than justice out here. These people," he gestured at the townspeople now emerging from their hiding places, "they'll always need someone strong to guide them." "Strong?" Crane's voice carried across the silent street. "Like you were strong when you burned out the Williams family? When you shot Marcus Turner in the back? When you forced Sarah Wallace's father to let a child die because your men needed attention first?" Each accusation landed like a physical blow, making Buck flinch despite himself. "You're just another killer," Buck snarled, his hand hovering near his gun. "Different costume, same story." "No." Crane removed his spectacles, folding them carefully and placing them in his pocket. "I'm a teacher, and today's final lesson is about the difference between justice and vengeance." Buck drew with legendary speed, his gun seeming to materialize in his hand. But Crane moved like morning mist, flowing around the bullet's path. Before anyone could blink, he was behind Buck, one hand resting almost gently on the gunman's shoulder. "You see," Crane continued, his voice still carrying that instructive tone, "I could kill you. Could have killed you and your brothers a dozen times over. But death is easy. Living with the consequences of your actions, that's the harder lesson." With a movement too quick to follow, he disarmed Buck and stepped back. "The war taught me something important, Mr. Hawkins. Every man I killed created a void that someone else would fill. But every man I educated changed the world around him." That's when Sheriff Wade stepped forward, his badge missing from his chest. Behind him stood Doc Wallace, Mary Sullivan, Old Tom Jenkins, and dozens of other townspeople. Each carried a piece of paper, evidence of the Hawkins brothers' crimes that Crane had systematically revealed over the past weeks. "Thomas Wade," Crane addressed the former sheriff, "your first lesson in redemption begins now." He handed Wade a pair of handcuffs. "Show the town that law serves justice, not power." Wade's hands shook as he approached Buck Hawkins, but his voice was firm. "You're under arrest for murder, extortion, and more crimes than I've got fingers to count them on." As the townspeople moved forward to help secure the Hawkins brothers and their remaining men, Sarah Wallace approached Crane. "Will you stay?" she asked. "The children still need a teacher." "A teacher?" Crane smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. "My work here is done, but yours is just beginning." He turned to address the gathering crowd. "Today you learned the most important lesson of all. Strength doesn't come from the ability to cause fear, but from the courage to stand against it." That evening, as the territorial marshals arrived to take the Hawkins brothers away, Timothy Crane vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared. Some say they saw him ride out, straight-backed and strong. No sign of the limp that had fooled so many. Others swear he simply faded away like morning mist. But his lessons remained. The schoolhouse stayed open, with Sarah Wallace taking up the role of teacher. The townspeople elected Tom Jenkins as their new mayor, and Wade's deputy, a young man who'd watched and learned from Crane's example, became the new sheriff. Thornwood began to heal, to grow, to become something more than just another cattle town ruled by fear. Years later, stories began to surface from other territories. Tales of a mild-mannered schoolmaster who appeared in troubled towns, who taught lessons both in classrooms and on dusty streets. Some said he was the same man, eternally moving from place to place, bringing education of a different sort to those who needed it most. But here in Thornwood, we remember him differently. Not as the ghost actor from the war, or as the deadly fighter who could appear and disappear at will. We remember him as the teacher who showed us that true strength lies not in the ability to instill fear, but in the courage to overcome it. They tore down the old schoolhouse eventually, built a proper brick one in its place. But they kept one piece, the blackboard where Timothy Crane wrote his last message to the town. Education is not just about learning facts and figures. It's about understanding the difference between what is and what could be. Remember that the greatest power you have is not in your guns or your fists, but in your ability to stand together against those who would rule through fear. Class dismissed. C. The Hawkins brothers served their time in the territorial prison, though some say they learned more in those few weeks under Crane's tutelage than in all their years behind bars. Cole, the smartest of the three, eventually wrote a book about their experience titled The Schoolmaster's Justice. In it, he wrote, "We thought we were the ones teaching Thornwood about power. In the end, one man with nothing but knowledge and courage taught us what real power looks like, and he did it without killing a single soul. As for me, I still play piano at the Silver Dollar, but these days the music is brighter, the laughter more genuine. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right and the evening sun catches the schoolhouse windows, I remember that summer when a limping schoolmaster taught a town full of cowboys the true meaning of strength. They say education can change the world. In Thornwood, we know it's true. Because sometimes the greatest gunfighter isn't the one with the fastest draw or the most notches on his belt. Sometimes it's the quiet man with wire-rimmed spectacles who knows that the most powerful weapon isn't a gun at all. It's knowledge. And in the end, that's the lesson that changed everything. 10 years have passed since Timothy Crane limped into Thornwood and changed everything. The town's grown considerably. We've got a proper railway station now, 3 schools instead of 1. And enough honest business to make the old days of Hawkins' rule seem like a bad dream. But some stories don't fade with time. They just grow deeper roots. I still remember the day Cole Hawkins returned to town. He'd served his time, gotten out early for good behavior, and wrote that book that made Thornwood famous across the territories. He looked different. Older, softer somehow, with reading glasses not unlike the ones Crane used to wear. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He came to the Silver Dollar where I still play piano, though these days I own a quarter share in the place. The whole room went quiet when he walked in, but not with the old fear. This was different. Anticipation, curiosity, maybe even a touch of sympathy. "Heard you were writing another book," I said as he settled at the bar. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast when you're known as the man who documented the ghost actor's most famous performance. "About education," Cole said quietly, nursing a coffee instead of whiskey. "About how one man with the right knowledge can change more lives than an army with guns." He pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "Been tracking stories across the territories. Crane's been busy." That got everyone's attention. The regulars drifted closer, pretending to mind their own business while straining to hear. Cole noticed, but didn't seem to mind. "Down in Nevada," he continued, "had a mining company squeezing the life out of it. Mysterious schoolmaster shows up, teaches for a few weeks. By the time he leaves, the miners have unionized, the company's corrupt managers are in jail, and 3 new schools are being built." He flipped through more pages. "Settlement in Dakota Territory. Range war about to explode between cattle barons. New teacher arrives, gives lessons in water rights and grazing laws. War ends before it begins, with both sides signing fair agreements. Sarah Wallace, now Sarah Jenkins since she married the mayor's son, joined us, her own teaching credentials pinned proudly to her dress." "He's still teaching then? Still fighting?" "Not fighting," Cole corrected. "Teaching. That's what I never understood back then. Every town he visits, he leaves behind more than just justice. He leaves knowledge. People who know their rights, who understand the law, who can read contracts and write letters and stand up for themselves." That's when Wesley Hawkins burst through the door. Unlike his brother, prison hadn't improved him much. His face was harder, his eyes wild with old grievances. But before anyone could react, an elderly man at a corner table cleared his throat. It was Doc Wallace, his hair gone fully white, but his mind still sharp as ever. "Wesley," he said calmly, "before you do anything rash, you might want to look around." Wesley did, and what he saw seemed to take the fire out of him. The Silver Dollar's patrons hadn't jumped in fear or reached for weapons. Instead, they watched him with something like pity. Young Tommy Wilson, now the town's sheriff, didn't even bother getting up from his card game. "Town's changed, brother," Cole said softly. "Best you change with it." Wesley's hand twitched toward his gun, but stopped when he noticed something peculiar. On every table, alongside the usual glasses and cards, there were books. History books, law books, penny novels, newspapers from back east, and behind the bar, where once had hung only bottles and mirrors, was a framed piece of chalkboard with familiar handwriting. "The greatest weapon against fear is understanding. The strongest defense against tyranny is knowledge." "He knew," Wesley whispered, his voice cracking. Somehow he knew, even back then. Wasn't just about stopping us, was about making sure no one like us could ever take control again. "Take a seat, Wesley," Mary Sullivan called from her usual table. "Got some books here about starting fresh. About redemption. Might do you some good." Something broke in Wesley then. Not like a glass shattering, but like ice melting in spring. He slumped onto a bar stool next to his brother, and for the first time in anyone's memory, he asked for something other than whiskey. "Got any of them reading primers?" he asked quietly. "Might be time I learned properly." Word of the Hawkins brothers' return spread through town, but not with the old terror. Thornwood had learned too well the lessons Crane taught. The next morning, Sarah opened the schoolhouse to find both brothers sitting in the back row of her adult education class, their heads bent over primers like chastened schoolboys. But the real surprise came 3 months later. A letter arrived at the schoolhouse, addressed simply to the people of Thornwood. Inside was a detailed map showing the locations of every town where Timothy Crane had taught his special brand of lessons. There were dozens of marks across the territories, each with a date and a brief note about what had changed. At the bottom was a simple message in that familiar, precise handwriting. Education is a flame that spreads from one candle to another, never diminishing the original light. You were my first real success, the first town that truly learned the lesson. Now I see your light spreading. Former students becoming teachers, knowledge replacing fear, justice growing from understanding rather than force. Remember, a gun can only protect one person at a time, but knowledge, properly shared, can shield entire communities. Keep teaching, keep learning, keep standing together. Your devoted schoolmaster, TCPS Wesley, your handwriting has improved considerably. Keep practicing. These days, Thornwood's become something of a pilgrimage site for folks wanting to understand how one man with nothing but knowledge and determination changed an entire territory. The old schoolhouse is a museum now, filled with books and stories about the ghost actor's greatest performance. But the real legacy isn't in the building or the books, it's in how the town faces challenges. When trouble comes, we don't reach for guns. We reach for understanding. We stand together. We teach each other. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I think I catch a glimpse of a slight figure with wire-rimmed spectacles watching from the shadows, checking on his star pupils. But maybe that's just an old piano player's fancy. The real ghost that haunts Thornwood isn't a person at all. It's the idea that true strength comes not from causing fear, but from helping others overcome it. And that's a lesson worth learning again and again. 20 years have passed since Timothy Crane first stepped onto Thornwood's dusty street, and his legend has grown like wildflowers after spring rain. But it's not just our town that keeps his memory alive. All across the Western Territories, a network of knowledge has sprouted from the seeds he planted. They call it the Schoolmaster's Circuit now, a string of towns stretching from Kansas to California, each with its own story about a mild-mannered teacher who arrived when needed most. Cole Hawkins, who'd made it his life's work to document these tales, finally published his second book, The Schoolmaster's Legacy: How One Man's Lessons Changed the West. I remember the day the first copies arrived in Thornwood. The whole town gathered in what we now call Legacy Square, the spot where Crane had faced down the Hawkins brothers 2 decades ago. Sarah Jenkins Wilson, she'd married young Tommy Wilson 5 years after the events, read passages aloud from the steps of the new library. In every town he visited, she read, her voice carrying clear in the evening air, Crane left behind more than just defeated tyrants. He left knowledge, understanding, and most importantly, teachers. People who would carry on his work, who understood that the greatest weapon against oppression isn't a gun, it's an educated mind. That's when Buck Hawkins himself stepped forward. The oldest brother had been the last to return to Thornwood, arriving 10 years after that fateful summer with nothing but a worn saddlebag and a lifetime of regrets. These days, he taught history at the school, specializing in lessons about how power corrupts and how to recognize the signs of tyranny. Found something interesting, Buck said, pulling out a yellowed telegram. Been corresponding with other towns on the circuit. Every place Crane visited, he left a piece of a larger puzzle. Took us years to put it together, but we finally figured it out. He unfolded a large map on a table, weighted down with books at each corner. Red lines connected dozens of towns across the territories, each marked with a date and a brief note. Look at the pattern, Cole added, tracing the lines with his finger. It wasn't random. He was building something, a network of educated communities, each protecting and supporting the others. When a trouble hits one town, knowledge and help flows in from all the rest. Wesley, who'd become the town's librarian, a twist that still brought smiles to older folks' faces, pointed to specific locations. Every town he visited had something in common. They were all strategic points. Rail hubs, river crossings, cattle trail intersections, places where ideas and information naturally flow through. But that's not all, Sarah added, excitement in her voice. Look at the dates. He wasn't just reacting to trouble, he was preventing it. Every town he visited was about to become a battleground between progress and tyranny. Railroad monopolies, cattle barons, corrupt officials, He hit them all before they could consolidate power. A young girl raised her hand, one of Sarah's students. But how did he know where to go? That's when Doc Wallace's daughter, Mary, now a physician herself, stepped forward. She'd been organizing her father's old papers and had found something extraordinary. "He had help," she said, holding up a stack of letters. "From us. All of us." The letters revealed a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. In every town Crane visited, he'd identified people of conscience: teachers, doctors, shop owners, ranchers. He'd taught them not just to stand up against tyranny, but to watch for its seeds in neighboring communities. They became his eyes and ears, warning him where he'd be needed next. "It wasn't just one man," Mary explained. "It was all of us. Every person who chose knowledge over fear, who decided to teach rather than threaten. We became part of something larger than ourselves." The evidence was there in the letters, a vast correspondence network that had grown from those early days. Towns warning each other about approaching dangers, sharing solutions to common problems, offering help and resources when needed. Crane hadn't just taught us to defend ourselves, he'd taught us to defend each other. And that's when Tommy Wilson, our sheriff of 15 years, added his own revelation. "Found these in the old jail records," he said, producing a set of wanted posters. Each showed a different man, but looking at them together, something became clear. The faces shared certain features. They could all have been Crane at different ages with different disguises. "He's still out there," Tommy said softly. "Still teaching. Still preparing towns for the challenges ahead. But now he doesn't have to do it alone." As if to prove his point, a young man stepped forward from the crowd. He was slight of build, wore wire-rimmed spectacles, and carried himself with a scholar's stoop. "Name's James Crawford," he said. "New schoolmaster over in Silver Creek. Had an interesting visitor last month. A gentleman with a limp who suggested I might learn something valuable in Thornwood." The crowd murmured. Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding. "He's not just building a network of towns," she said. "He's building a network of teachers, each one learning from the last, each one carrying the lessons forward." That evening, as the town celebrated the 20th anniversary of their liberation, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. Other visitors arrived: teachers, doctors, lawyers, all with similar stories. Each had met a mysterious mentor who'd guided them toward this moment, this gathering. "Look at the map again," Cole suggested. The red lines no longer seemed random. They formed a pattern, a web of connection and protection spreading across the territories. "He's not just changing towns one at a time. He's changing the entire West, one lesson at a time." As night fell, lanterns were lit in Legacy Square, and the visitors shared stories late into the evening. Tales of other towns that had found their courage, other communities that had learned to stand together. The schoolmaster's circuit was more than just a legend now. It was a living network of knowledge and mutual support. And somewhere out there, we all knew, a mild-mannered teacher with a limp and wire-rimmed spectacles was walking into another town, ready to begin another lesson. Because some stories don't end. They just keep teaching, growing, spreading, until the learning becomes part of who we are. The gathering in Legacy Square that night sparked something new in Thornwood's story. As the visitors shared their tales, patterns emerged that even Cole Hawkins hadn't discovered in his research. Each town on the schoolmaster's circuit had received not just lessons in justice, but pieces of a greater plan, one that was only now becoming clear. James Crawford, the young schoolmaster from Silver Creek, produced a leather-bound journal. "He left this with me," he said, adjusting his spectacles in a way that brought smiles of recognition to the older folks present. "Said I'd know when to share it." The journal was written in Crane's precise hand, but it wasn't just a record of his travels. It was a blueprint, a detailed plan for what he called the education of the territories. Page after page outlined methods for identifying communities at risk, strategies for building networks of support, and, most importantly, ways to teach others to become teachers themselves. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a particular passage. "He writes, The greatest victory isn't in defeating those who would rule through fear. It's in making such rule impossible. Every community must become both student and teacher, learning from its neighbors while sharing its own hard-won wisdom. That's when Buck Hawkins made a remarkable connection. The circuit isn't just about stopping men like we were, he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned understanding. It's about changing the very nature of power in the West. Wesley, who'd been studying the journal's maps, nodded in agreement. Each town he visited sits at a crucial point, not just geographically, but socially, places where ideas and influence naturally flow. By changing these key points, he's changing the entire territory. Mary Wallace stepped forward, holding another set of letters she'd discovered in her father's archives. "There's more," she said. "These are from other doctors across the circuit. Crane didn't just teach justice. He helped establish medical clinics, law offices, newspapers, everything a town needs to stand independent of corrupt influence." Tommy Wilson, who'd been quietly observing, added his own insight. "And look at the timing. Each town he visited was at a crucial moment, not just facing immediate threats but approaching opportunities for real change. He didn't just put out fires, he built fire breaks." The evidence was compelling. In every town along the circuit, Crane had established not just schools but entire networks of civic institutions. Libraries stocked with law books and scientific journals. Newspapers committed to printing truth rather than power's propaganda. Medical clinics that treated all patients equally, regardless of status or wealth. "But here's the most remarkable thing," Cole said, producing a fresh telegram. "Just received this from a contact in the territorial capital. They're about to pass a new law requiring every town to establish free schools. Guess who's been quietly advising the education committee?" A ripple of understanding passed through the crowd. Even now, 20 years later, Crane was still teaching, still shaping the territory's future. Not through force or fear, but through the patient work of education and influence. Young Amy Wilson, Tommy's daughter, and one of Sarah's star pupils, raised her hand. "But why did he start here? Why Thornwood?" It was old Tom Jenkins who answered, his voice carrying the wisdom of years. "Because we were ready to learn," he said simply. "Not just about standing up to the Hawkins boys, but about standing together, about building something that would last." As if to prove his point, more visitors arrived over the next few days. Teachers from across the territories, each carrying their own pieces of Crane's legacy. They brought books, letters, journals, each containing another part of his grand design. "It's like a giant lesson plan," Sarah observed, as they pieced together the information. Each town learning something different, but all part of the same curriculum. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity. Towns that had learned about legal rights were connected with communities that had mastered economic cooperation. Places that had developed strong civic institutions shared their knowledge with settlements just beginning to organize. The circuit wasn't just a network, it was a living, growing organism of mutual support and education. But perhaps the most surprising revelation came from an unexpected source. A young woman arrived from back east, carrying a stack of military records she'd obtained through careful research. She introduced herself as Margaret Chen, a historian studying the ghost actor's war years. "Timothy Crane wasn't just one man," she explained, spreading the documents on a table. "He was part of a small unit of specialized operatives, men and women trained not just in combat and disguise, but in education and community building. They were preparing for the peace even while fighting the war." The records showed that Crane and his colleagues had understood something profound, that the real battles for America's future wouldn't be fought with guns and cannons, but with books and ideas. They had spent years developing their methods, testing them in small ways during the conflict, preparing for the day when they could truly begin their work. "So there are others?" Tommy asked, studying the records. "Other schoolmasters out there?" Margaret smiled. "Look at your own circuit. Look at how many towns report being visited by teachers who moved like shadows, who taught lessons deeper than reading and writing. The ghost actor's greatest trick wasn't just his disguises, it was making us believe he was working alone. As night fell over Legacy Square for the second evening, lanterns casting warm light on faces both familiar and new, the full scope of Crane's vision began to emerge. He hadn't just saved one town or built one network. He had seeded the entire West with a new kind of strength. Not the power of the gun or the dollar, but the enduring might of knowledge shared and courage taught. In the end, Cole read from his newest manuscript, the greatest lesson wasn't about fighting or hiding or even teaching. It was about believing that people, given the knowledge and the chance, will choose to stand together. That education isn't just about learning facts, but about learning hope. And somewhere out there, perhaps watching from the shadows, a mild-mannered teacher with wire-rimmed spectacles and a limp that came and went was smiling, knowing that his greatest lesson plan was proceeding exactly as designed. As the gathering in Thornwood drew to a close, one final surprise awaited those who had come to understand the schoolmaster's legacy. A young boy burst into Legacy Square, waving a telegram that had just arrived at the station. "There's a new schoolmaster in Dead River," he announced breathlessly. "Limps a little, wears spectacles, carrying books." The news sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Dead River was a notorious town, ruled by mining companies who kept their workers in virtual slavery through company scrip and hired guns. It was exactly the kind of place that needed the kind of lesson Thornwood had learned so many years ago. "Should we send help?" Tommy Wilson asked, already reaching for his badge. Cole Hawkins shook his head, a knowing smile on his face. "That's not how it works. Remember what he taught us. Every town has to learn its own way, fight its own battles. But," he paused, looking at the gathered representatives of the schoolmaster's circuit, "we can make sure they have the tools they need to learn." Within hours, wagons were being loaded. Not with guns or ammunition, but with books, printing presses, and other tools of education. The circuit was responding the way Crane had taught them, not with force, but with knowledge. "You know what this means," Sarah said quietly, watching the preparations. "He's still out there, still teaching, still fighting the good fight, just like he promised." That's when Wesley Hawkins, the once violent brother who'd found redemption in books, made a thoughtful observation. "Maybe that's the real trick of it," he said. "Maybe there isn't just one schoolmaster anymore. Maybe we're all carrying a piece of him now, teaching in our own ways." His words carried more truth than anyone had realized. As the gathered members of the circuit shared their stories one last time, it became clear that Timothy Crane's greatest accomplishment wasn't in the battles he'd won or the tyrants he'd overthrown. It was in how he'd taught others to become teachers themselves. Buck Hawkins, now an old man, but still sharp as ever, stood to address the crowd. 20 years ago, I thought power came from the barrel of a gun, thought strength meant making others fear you. Then a limping schoolmaster showed us all a different kind of strength, showed us that real power isn't about what you can take from others, it's about what you can teach them. As evening fell on the final day of the gathering, something remarkable happened. A letter arrived, delivered by a young man who vanished before anyone could question him too closely. The handwriting was familiar. Precise, educated, unmistakable. "My dear students," Sarah read aloud, her voice carrying in the hushed square. 20 years ago, I came to Thornwood with a dream, not just of freeing one town from tyranny, but of teaching the entire West how to remain free. You were my first real success, the template for everything that followed. Now, as I watch the schoolmaster's circuit grow and spread, I see that dream becoming reality. Each of you has become a teacher in your own right, passing on the lessons of courage, unity, and the power of knowledge. The frail schoolmaster who limped into your town was never the point. He was just the first chapter in a much larger story. Remember, education isn't just about books and figures. It's about understanding, about seeing the truth behind the lies power tells to justify itself, about recognizing that real strength lies not in causing fear, but in helping others overcome it. I'm proud of you all, proud of what Thornwood has become, proud of how the circuit has grown, but most of all, I'm proud that you've learned the hardest lesson of all, that the best teacher is one who makes themselves unnecessary. Keep teaching, keep learning, keep standing together. Your devoted teacher, T.C. The letter confirmed what many had begun to suspect, that Crane's apparent appearances across the territory weren't all the work of one man. He had created something far more powerful than a single, legendary figure. He had created a movement, an idea that could be passed from person to person, town to town, territory to territory. So when people spot him in different places, Amy Wilson said thoughtfully, they're not always seeing the same person? They're seeing what he taught us to be, Cole answered. Teachers, protectors, people who understand that knowledge is the greatest weapon against tyranny. As night fell on Thornwood for the last time during the gathering, the town had changed yet again. Not physically. The buildings were the same, the streets still dusty, the evening wind still carrying the scent of sage. But understanding had deepened. The circuit wasn't just a network of towns or a collection of teachers. It was a living testament to the idea that one person, armed with knowledge and determination, could change not just a town, but an entire way of life. The wagons departed the next morning, carrying books and hope to Dead River. The representatives of the circuit returned to their own towns, carrying new understanding of their shared purpose. And somewhere out there, perhaps in a dusty classroom or on a windswept street, a mild-mannered teacher was adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, preparing to teach another town about the true meaning of strength. They say the West was one with guns and grit, but here in Thornwood we know better. It was one with books and courage, with learning and unity, with the patient work of teachers who understood that the greatest victories aren't won with bullets, but with knowledge. And if sometimes, on quiet evenings, folks catch a glimpse of a slight figure limping past the schoolhouse, well, maybe it's just a reminder that some lessons never really end. They just keep teaching, keep spreading, keep changing the world one student at a time. Because in the end, that's what Timothy Crane taught us best of all. That education isn't just about learning facts, it's about learning to stand together, about helping others find their own strength, about building something that will last long after the teacher has moved on. And that's a lesson worth remembering, worth sharing, worth teaching to every new generation that comes along. Class dismissed.